all the way great. I'm Mike Nichols. I'm the president and CEO for the Coalition for the Homeless of Houston and Harris County and Montgomery and Fort Bend counties. And it is truly my honor to work in this area, to work with these individuals, not only at the coalition, but in the way home and our government partners and stakeholders. It's quite amazing. I have to, I've always having something else going on. I'm actually, Michael Kimmelman, I have to apologize to you. After I introduce you, I actually have to sneak out to catch a plane to see my brand new granddaughter. So I appreciate that. I will listen live stream. It is my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Michael Kimmelman, the author of the New York Times article, How Houston Moved 25,000 People from the Streets into Homes of Their Own. One of the important roles that the coalition plays is to educate influencers in government, media, philanthropy on the positive impact of the Way Home, our homeless response system, and to advocate for support and funding for the partners of the Way Home. Thus, we are very excited to have Michael Kimmelman of the New York Times as a keynote speaker. Michael and his team spent a great deal of time with the Way Home partners, with our clients, with government funders, with folks who house people, writing the well-researched and thoughtful article that he did in the New York Times. It's one of those times in your life that you have a reporter work with you for days and days and hours and think, how's this going to come out right? In fact, I asked Michael, I challenged him and I said, Michael, how do you write an interesting article that explains this complex work that is being done in Houston? And what he and his team did is they succeeded in writing this incredibly positive article that had a far-reaching effect. Readers around the nation have responded to the success of the Way Home, and government, nonprofit, and philanthropic leaders from across the nation have worked with the coalition, with Way Home partners, with the city of Houston, with Harris County to learn about the work that we do. But equally as important, the Way Home gained support locally with both local leaders and citizens. Even the work on the Navigation Center probably wouldn't have come to fruition after 5 years of work, Mark Eichenbaum, without the good work and the good words from the New York Times article. Folks around the city said that was an amazing article that really had an impact on the city. A senior executive at a major search firm told me that when he recruits potential executives to come to Houston, he can actually overcome the complaints about our heat and humidity, our mosquitoes and giant roaches by pointing out to the Houston can-do attitudes of public-private partnerships on two particular items, parks and homelessness. And it's really great that we are one of those two items. I recently finished Michael Kimmelman's book, The Intimate City. And in the introduction, I want to read one of the paragraphs, which is the essence of city life. After all, the heart of the urban compact. No matter how much time we spend isolated in our homes or in our thoughts, a city is a collective understanding, a shared responsibility, sacrifice, and accomplishment. Togetherness is the fundamental civic building block, the basis for a deliberative cosmopolis. Today, cosmopolitan cities welcome different people and different cultures. In philosophy, how do you pronounce it? Being cosmopolitan goes back to the Greek Stoics. The philosopher Immanuel Kant associated cosmopolitan with hospitality and a common understanding that human beings are members of a universal community with a shared right of humanity. Now, he uses the word New York City in the next sentence. I'm just going to use the word cities. By this definition, cities just might be humanity's greatest accomplishment. And that's what we do here in this room. That's what we do as part of the way home, is we're part of making cities, part of having different people in different cultures in a collective understanding and a shared responsibility. In so many ways, the way home, the work that is done here, is the underpinning of the Houston's future. Michael Kimmelman is the longtime architect critic of the New York Times, writing broadly on urban and social affairs, and the founder and editor at large of Headway, a nonprofit journalistic initiative at the Times focused on global challenges and paths toward progress. As a columnist at the New York Times, he has reported from more than 40 countries, and for years was the Times chief art critic. Twice a Pulitzer finalist, and I am hoping that he'll be a Pulitzer winner for the article on homelessness. Please welcome Michael Kimmelman.
Thanks. This I don't need mic, because I'm mic'd.
Oh, you're mic'd up.
So, hi everybody. I know we're running late. Let me just finish some business I wanted to left undone. First of all, Mike, congratulations about your new grandchild, which is great. Secondly, I knew about the heat and humidity, but had no idea about the giant roaches. So welcome to Houston, I guess. One little business thing, Headway, my colleagues included in, I think, your program as a little call out for those of you who have a moment to take the time to fill it out. That would be really great. Part of Headway's mission is not just to publish things, but to follow up and remain engaged with the communities we're writing about. And so we really want to develop an ongoing relationship with you guys. So if you can take a moment and fill those things out, that would be terrific. And two other things before I begin the talk I prepared, because they come out of some of the comments I was hearing this morning. I find it interesting that you included a health clinic at the Navigation Center. I'm going to mention something around that coming up, but that sort of community engagement, I think, is crucial to building trust and a sense of investment by people who are there. And then there was this other thing that Mark mentioned about blighted buildings and removal in the neighborhood. And I just wanted to say, I'm looking now into a study that's been ongoing for way more than a decade in Philadelphia and now in some other cities. And it involves fixing up vacant lots and derelict buildings. And I'll just tell you that for relatively small investment, the study has shown that there are several results. One is that you have a marked significance in violent crime around those sites, but also that there are specific health results. This study was done by the University of Pennsylvania and Columbia, the medical schools there. And among other things, for instance, these are areas often with high incidences of heart problems and other issues around around health. And heartbeats on average drop by 15 beats per minute in places where there have been these interventions. Just a little thought, completely unrelated to this, but it's just an interesting question. You know, the cities we build are not just about beautiful buildings, but about public health, public safety, and this shared space. So let me start with a few questions. Some of these were organized by Headway. When we started, we called this Project Hindsight. We asked some questions just to give people a sense of whether they are have an accurate idea of what's going on around some big issues. This is not quite homelessness yet, but let me ask you, what progress do you think Europe has made in cutting greenhouse gas emissions? So in 2009, the European Union pledged that its emissions in 2020 would be 20% lower than they were in 1990. Did they meet the goal or did they not meet the goal? Are emissions lower? So first of all, are the emissions lower? How many see by a show of hands? What about higher? They failed. Interestingly, either you're just staying out of it or you are about the same. Do you think, by the way, we've made progress in reducing extreme poverty in the world? 36% of the world's population used to live on less than $1.25 a day. That was in 1990. Again, UN pledged to cut that in half. Did they manage or not? So is extreme poverty, is it lower or is it higher than it used to be? Lower? Higher? Okay. Good news. Lower, quite a lot, actually. The answer is 12%. The goal was exceeded. Same with clean drinking water. Is in 1990, 25% of the world's population did not have drinking water from an approved source like a pipe or well. UN pledged in 2000 that by 2015, it would cut that portion to 15%. Did they succeed or did they fail? So is there more clean drinking water or less? More? You're getting the hang of it? Less? Right. So they actually cut it by quite a great deal. Instead of 25%, the answer is only 7%. And the goal was met 3 years before the deadline. All right, last one. Corporate deforestation. In 2010, the Consumer Goods Forum pledged to help end deforestation by 2020 on behalf of its roughly 400 corporate members. And some companies like Nestle and Carrefour vowed to eliminate deforestation from the supply chains. How many companies of the 400 succeeded? Let's just put it this way. I'll ask you, did half of them succeed? Hands? All right. A quarter of them succeed? None of them succeed? None of them succeeded. So the news is not all good. But I wanted to ask you that because I think we make assumptions and we don't always know the answers to them. And we make those assumptions, for instance, about rising crime. New Yorkers are always saying crime is on the rise in New York now. It's actually fallen, and certainly around homelessness. So it was the answer to a similar question about the national homeless count that led me to write about Houston. As you know, but I didn't, the homeless count across the US has been ticking down, not up, since 2007. And I believe it's still lower nationwide than it was, even with the uptick since 2016. Even if we all know that these numbers are, guesstimates based on pit counts, not always done as well as you do them here, I think most Americans, and not just those in big coastal cities, would be surprised to know that the number has not been skyrocketing everywhere. And who can blame them? So I am the architecture critic at the Times. So by my reckoning of the job, I write about the built world, which means neighborhoods, communities, cities, and societies that we are building. And the first column I wrote when I returned from Europe in 2011 was about a subsidized housing development in the South Bronx called Via Verde, which mixed first-time co-op owners with formerly homeless Section 8 rental tenants in an exceptional work of architecture that included a community garden and a health clinic, because the neighborhood is a food desert with high rates of asthma and diabetes. And that's what the community asked for. So that's the example I wanted to mention. The slightly higher premium cost for architecture of quality paid off in terms of the upkeep and successful social outcomes among residents who've overwhelmingly remained in place all these years. Because I was writing about architecture of affordable housing, focusing on those needs, pretty soon after I started my job, I began to hear from people about homelessness. And I was also noticing that the number of people living on the streets and subways in New York was rising. And that certainly was true in other cities like San Francisco and Los Angeles and so forth. So when I began to hear from homeless advocates like you guys that in fact homeless counts were not rising everywhere, and in some cases had fallen, like in Houston, that you were making headway, and therefore that homelessness was not a calamity only destined to get worse, but a potentially fixable problem. I thought that was news, because all I ever read in newspapers and magazines were stories that led people to believe homelessness was intractable. It wasn't that I wanted to spread good news to make people feel better and worry less. It was partly my journalist instinct. After all, what is more fun than telling people that the reverse is true about something they probably took for granted? But more than that, I also felt that all the negative doom-scrolling stories about homelessness fed into a cycle of pessimism and despair that made people both more hostile to the unhoused and more complacent. Without hope, why bother? Plus, I was just curious, how did the numbers come down? At what costs and to whom? And why, I wondered, are we always reading heartbreaking profiles about people who have lost their homes, or about shopkeepers whose businesses are destroyed by metastasizing encampments next door, or about unsheltered New Yorkers with mental illness attacking people, but rarely stories, I mean, in-depth, deeply rooted, accessible stories, hopefully, about what works or might work, or about the obstacles to progress. It seemed to me useful to unpack the problem, lay it out in as clear and precise terms as I could, so as to encourage at least a constructive conversation in the public about the issue. Starting with the very definition of homelessness, I learned so much from you guys and so many people in this room I am so grateful to. But one of the things you spent a lot of time trying to instruct me on was about your vocabulary. You, in homeless services, speak a foreign language full of acronyms and incomprehensible assumptions. The public has no idea what you are talking about. Journalists love to tell juicy, salacious, scandalous stories, not unpack the minutia of the Hearth Act or explain the obscure definition of chronic homelessness, or parse the difference between the Coalition for the Homeless and the continuum of care, or between rapid housing and permanent supportive housing. Nobody outside the bubble has the slightest idea what you're talking about when you bandy these terms around, which means you're speaking a different language. And if you don't share a language, you can't talk about the problem, which you need to do if you depend on public dollars, taxpayer support, private donation, or other assistance. Shaping the narrative may sound like politicking at its worst, but it is critical to public buy-in. What I wanted to communicate in my story was that Houston, however precarious the progress, proves that homelessness is not intractable. That while we will never eliminate it entirely, because people will always fall into homelessness for a variety of reasons, we can make homelessness increasingly rare and brief, to borrow Roseanne Haggerty's phrase, and therefore that we cannot give in to the hopelessness or the indifference or the dehumanization that, especially for many city dwellers, becomes a kind of armor against the daily sight of suffering and the encounters with people who don't have the access to showers or change of clothes or food or cash or mental health care or a good education or a bed. Yes, people need to gird themselves to deal with all the suffering and guilt and anger. And hanging around with some of you for a while, I was truly in awe of your capacity to compartmentalize day in, day out, and to deal with this, because this is the only way progress happens. It's a lesson I grasp dimly as a journalist and critic, a job that involves a little frustrating, grinding work, which never seems to end. But it is definitely not the same as being, say, a caseworker who is disgracefully underpaid and overworked, with his or her own fears about escalating housing costs and inflation, At the same time, you're juggling the urgent demands of 24 or more troubled, vulnerable clients. Talking to caseworkers reinforced for me the point that we cannot succumb to the excuse that progress is impossible, because as you guys prove every day, that is literally wrong. But to be more precise, the problem is too big for us to solve as individuals, even as individual organizations. It is a systemic problem that demands a systemic approach. And this is where we are all failing as a society and a democracy, and not just around homelessness, but around so many big issues today, like transit, education, water and flood management, climate change, and of course, affordable housing. As a writer, the systemic aspect of Houston's work was perhaps the biggest challenge for me. It's much easier to profile a person in distress or describe a crime or act of malfeasance, which provokes outrage in readers and shines light in a dark place. That is our bread and butter as journalists. It is much more difficult to describe a system with all its bureaucracy, especially one that you are trying to suggest works. So on Tuesday, I actually spoke about Houston and homelessness to an audience at a church in Cambridge, Massachusetts. The church has been a local service provider since 1633. And today, still around, it offers homeless services and organizes what's called the Friday Cafe, where volunteers donate food and serve meals to anyone who wishes to stop in for a free dinner on Friday evenings. My hosts showed a short, lovely film by an award-winning filmmaker in Cambridge about the cafe, and it was obvious watching it that the people who donated the rice pilafs and the fajitas and cookies and cakes were acting from the heart and felt a great sense of pride and accomplishment at directly seeing how their contributions served people in need. There was an intimacy to their act and to the rewards, both for those giving and those receiving. But Cambridge, like Boston at large, has a homeless problem that is not getting better. The system there is broken. Now, I suspect nobody here loves to pay taxes or believes the government and big organizations are perfectly well-oiled machines that always run things efficiently and achieve exceptional results. We are, I think, by nature, a country of proud individualists and entrepreneurs. We are distrustful of government bureaucracy and believe capitalism thrives when 1,000 flowers are allowed to bloom, or at least that's the myth we like to tell ourselves when it serves our purposes. So we may flinch at words like systems and systemic. I heard Mark mention this before. The story of Houston's grinding, systemic approach to tackling homelessness, I think, runs against some very deep-seated emotional, personal, cultural inclinations we have as Americans. Houston's system works because the whole subsumes individual contributions into a larger, collective, more effective endeavor. The sum is greater than the parts. It requires that those participating in the continuum, who may have previously done one thing, do other things, and the rewards may feel less tangible, personal, and immediate. And because of the different incentives and financial imperatives of this country for NGOs, government agencies, and corporations, everyone really, local aid organizations, public and private, we operate in silos, competing for the same funds, duplicating services, not sharing information and goals. That's the American way. And I get it. If you run a food pantry and serve the homeless and you serve twice as many people this year as you did last year, by your reckoning, that may be proof of success and a selling point when you go hat in hand to private funders and government agencies. I know I'm here speaking to the preaching of the converted. You're successful at a goal that you set for yourself, and you are doing good works. But the uptick suggests you are not necessarily helping to reduce homelessness. Maybe food pantry isn't the best example, but you get the point. I wanted to tell readers that homelessness requires a team effort. Maybe instead of system or bureaucracy, we should just call it teamwork. The Astros didn't win the World Series by letting every player do whatever they wanted or play, whatever position they felt like playing. You guys did some other things as a Yankee fan, which I'm not so happy with, but let's just agree to disagree. I couldn't help myself. The US military isn't the most formidable fighting force in the world because it allows every combat unit to come up with its own strategy and goals. The battle to end homelessness is like a wartime effort. It's a grind, and there is no painless magical fix. As Mark put it in my article, housing people is a slow, extremely complicated, incremental process that requires all hands on deck all the time if you don't want to settle for the status quo, much less go backwards. Everyone has to come together around the table, and it's amazing to see you all here. Frankly, that's the language you hear from winning coaches and managers. We celebrate this talk in sports and battle. We need to do the same when it comes publicly, to tackling homelessness. It turns out, fortunately, that people are actually hungry for these stories to explain how things work or could work, especially when the stories point in the direction that Houston does. And that was the overwhelming response we got at the Times to this piece. More than 1 million people read it. Actually, many, many more than 1 million people read it. 3,000 people responded to our call-outs, including many who had experienced homelessness, which inspired a follow-up project we did, the Headway team, 60 portraits of formerly homeless people telling their own stories in their own words, because a goal at Headway is to listen to lived experience and to give voice to the people we write about. Those portraits in turn prompted hundreds more responses, so we are following up on those to produce further articles, and we hope other forms of engagement with you here in Houston and elsewhere that track progress over time. I won't remind you of some of the things that I heard happened here. Mike mentioned them. I'm very glad to hear other cities have come to see Houston and learn from you. I know there are also people who are annoyed about hearing more about Houston. You can't have it both ways. And I think that's one of the costs in this country of being successful. But I also think that it's an important point that Mike raised about that headhunter, because it's obviously been good for the economy and the reputation of the city, that people hear you are tackling this problem in a humane and successful way. And I gather the article has prompted some conversations locally, I hope so, about the need for more one-bedroom apartments, conversion of derelict properties, and possibly the construction of new ones. New housing does take time, but it is desperately needed. And I hope Houston also pursues the idea, not new here, of a community land trust. These days, These days we're inclined, I think, to politicize everything, and we have become expert at saying no. There are untold numbers of self-described progressives in cities where homelessness is rising who talk a good game about wanting to help the unhoused, but just not in their neighborhoods. They may believe they are acting in the interests of their communities, to preserve the environment or historic neighborhoods or architecture, or to protect property rights and values, but they are weaponizing environmental laws and land use regulations and acting on covenants to obstruct, delay, preferably kill, the construction of more subsidized housing. We have a national affordable housing crisis, and we are doing shockingly little. To address it, we need leadership in City Hall and the state houses and the White House, and there is no more urgent problem today. After all, homelessness is many things, but it is first of all a housing problem. And I'll just tell you the number of severely cost-burdened households, meaning households paying more than 50% of their income on housing, has risen nationwide since 2007 by 7%. In cities like New York and LA and Seattle and so forth, this story is much, much worse. Give me a second. I'm just going to give you some numbers about New York because they're on my mind, and I don't know if they'll make you feel better or whatever. So in New York, rents have risen by 30% since 2015 and home prices by 50%. The vacancy rate for apartments renting for less than $1,500 per month, which is the median rent for renter-occupied housing in New York City, is under 1%. Sorry, I need some water, but sorry. Is under 1%. For those seeking to rent apartments for under $900, which is not nothing, it's lower than 1%. Between 2017 and 21 alone, New York City lost 96,000 units with rents under $1,500 a month and gained 107,000 units with rents of $2,300 or more. And I read this morning that the median rent on new leases in New York rose to more than $4,100 a month from $3,400 in 2019, which is already obscene. Not coincidentally, homelessness is at record levels. The Times published, oh, thank you so much. Great. The Times published a report last week that 80% of New Yorkers now are severely rent burdened. The answer, a universal right to housing, sounds socialistic and would require a wartime-style construction effort in places where many people believe their neighborhoods are already dense enough that more housing would damage the character of their streets and their community. They negotiate downscale projects that offer meaningful change. And then when a few units get built, they pat themselves on the back and point to places that are doing even less. I will give you one example. In 2016, activists in Upper Manhattan derailed a proposal to construct a 15-story, 355-unit residence on the site of a derelict garage. Okay, I'll do my best. The building was going to be the first project by de Blasio, Mayor de Blasio's involving his mandatory inclusionary zoning program, which requires the new developments have 20% units below market rate. But, and without the rezoning, the developer could have done this, put up a 14-story building, all market rate. But in fact, the developer agreed that half of the units, 178 of them, would be rent subsidized. So way more than was required. And people in that community opposed the projects. They literally took to the streets, declaring the construction of any new market rate housing, quote, an existential threat to our homes and our community. So the developer simply abandoned the project. The neighborhood, which desperately needs more housing, got zero. We are clearly lying to ourselves. And I know there are those in Texas and elsewhere who believe another response to dealing with homelessness is about personal responsibility, insisting somehow that people on the streets, in effect, repent for their own suffering before they're eligible for a home. They argue that drug addicts, for instance, shouldn't get priority for subsidized housing over hardworking mothers living in precarious housing or not getting a free ride, as if the richest country on the planet shouldn't be able to house both. There are obviously addiction recovery and religious conversion programs that succeed, and I know some are contributing to Houston's success. But as I wrote, when you're drowning, it does not help if your rescuer insists you learn to swim before returning you to shore. You can address your problems once you're on land or not. What I think my article did was to spread the word about housing first, or at least explain the term to people. I suspect we all have neighbors with addiction or mental health issues, but we don't consider someone's sobriety or mental state a prerequisite for whether they may live next to us or have a home. And we tend to believe that their challenges, like other private matters, are their own business, not ours. But then when someone is homeless, we suddenly see their problems as our business because that person is living in public, which can lead us to conclude that the addiction or mental health problem is the root cause of homelessness, even though the inevitable stress and terror of being unhoused would lead anyone to self-medicate or fall into clinical depression or other unhealthy state that registers maybe to passersby as a mental health or addiction problem. I'm glad that Kelly mentioned earlier what I know you all take for granted. That assumption that people on the streets are mentally ill is an excuse, I think, for many people to not treat everybody as they would any other neighbor and to catalog this as a mental health problem, which is, as you all know better than I do, so wrong. So I won't, I can tell that I'm running a little over. I just wanted to say, I think two quick things. The economic and real estate situation has obviously changed in Houston as well. I know evictions are up here, and I gather that the landlord team, Ashley, who's so great at everything, clearly, has really deserves applause. Yeah, has worked really hard to ensure that so far the Way Homes clients are not the ones being evicted. And I know that there's a pilot program offering landlord holding fees, essentially, I guess, rental payments until client subsidies kick in, which allows continuum clients to compete with private people who can pay upfront. And the money for that plan, I gather, is coming from Houston's Downtown Management District, which is further proof to me that you guys continue to bring a range of public and private interests to the table. But look, financial year system is built on Harvey and COVID relief dollars. And while the feds annually fund the COC, they're directing grants to cities that have the largest unsheltered populations now, which makes sense, but also means Houston is effectively being punished for its success. You need an endowment. I used to write about things in the art world, where a museum like the Metropolitan, say, has an endowment of $3 billion. So pick a number, $50 million for Houston to continue to house homeless and not fall behind. Seems like peanuts to me for local corporations and wealthy neighbors who obviously benefit from your work. I know there's a lot of competition for those private dollars, but I think what you've done has been so great for Houston, and of course for the thousands of people you have helped who are in their most desperate circumstances, that it should not really be a heavy lift for people to understand here that putting together an endowment to just allow you to continue doing that work is money well spent. I gather, after all, that you know Houston has been using this success to recruit business executives and medical and tech stars. So it seems like a clear argument. And what the Times and Headway got back from our public was a hunger to know more about what works, what is possible, and not just be told that everything is going haywire. Because in the end, I believe, a majority of us seek common ground and common cause if we are just given some reason to hope. Houston gives people hope that homelessness is a problem we can tackle together. Thank you so much. It's an honor to be here.
Thank you so much, Michael. We really, really appreciate it. And we are so grateful that you were able to join us today. We can't thank you enough. And so we will continue. And I am really excited to bring up the next part of our session. All right. Questions? Okay. Okay. Questions? Sure. It's okay. It's okay. Is he on?
No, I have my thing on.
Is he on? Okay.
Are there any questions? I'm happy to answer questions about anything you want. I was about the Times or whatever. If you don't have any, I don't want to keep you all after. I'm a little like dinner theater, you know, like you guys are eating during this. So I'm sorry I didn't. In my other life, I'm a pianist, so I felt I should have been playing something for you. Say again? Oh, but I'm not going to. So, anything? No. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.